Google has changed the way it approaches smartphones quite a bit over the years. Today, the Pixel lineup is smaller, more polished, and facing less competition than it used to. Sales are higher, the software is more refined, and Google seems to have a formula that works. So naturally, you might expect the Pixel 11 series to simply continue that formula, and in many ways it does. The new Pixel 11 lineup is Google's most refined yet. The designs are sleek, the software is smart, and the displays are excellent. But there's one problem: they're also becoming a little boring. Google has now followed essentially the same design language for 3 generations, while prices continue to move upward. And this year, some areas of the hardware have actually gone backwards. That doesn't make the Pixel 11 series bad. Far from it. These are still some of the best phones of 2026. But Google isn't only competing with Apple and Samsung anymore, it's also competing with the Pixels it made before. So let's take a closer look at what Google actually changed this year, and whether the Pixel 11 series is really worth your attention. Google's 2026 lineup includes 3 traditional flat phones and 1 foldable. The flat Pixels are all the same basic size, and when you put them next to last year's models, it can be surprisingly difficult to tell them apart. The aluminum and glass construction is almost unchanged. That isn't necessarily a bad thing. The design still looks clean and premium, and the phones feel extremely solid in the hand. Google has also finally addressed one small but annoying issue. The buttons are now much less wobbly. The base Pixel 11 gets a flatter camera bar as well, which makes the phone slightly more comfortable when you put it into a pocket. And Pixel Snap is still here. The international versions and the Pixel 11 Pro Fold also retain their SIM card slots. On the Pixel 11 Pro and Pro X Large, Google keeps the taller camera bar on the back. One thing I do like is the centered camera placement. You can put the phone down on a table and interact with it without it feeling excessively unstable. The Pixel 11 Pro Fold is different. Its camera module remains off-center, so the phone isn't quite as stable when it's sitting on a flat surface. But then we get to one of the strangest additions of the entire lineup: the new highlight module. On the Pro phones, Google has placed a ring of LEDs inside the camera flash. The basic idea is to give the phone something similar to the notification LEDs we used to have years ago, except Google has tied most of its functionality to Gemini. It can indicate when the AI is listening or responding, and it can also light up when one of your favorite contacts calls. And honestly, this feels like a very strange choice. A notification LED could make sense if it actually provided a lot of useful information. But right now, highlight is extremely limited. In fact, I'd rather have the thermometer back. At least the thermometer had a clear purpose, even if you didn't use it very often. Highlight feels like a feature that was added because Google could add it, not because the phone really needed it. Google says more functionality is coming later, but that's the frustrating part. We've had notification LEDs figured out for decades. Why does this one feel like it's arriving one feature at a time? Thankfully, the displays are much easier to praise. All of the Pixel 11 OLED screens look fantastic, and Google says they're now twice as scratch-resistant. The base Pixel 11 keeps essentially the same display, while the other models receive a brightness increase. Even the Pixel 11, which remains at around 3000 nits, is perfectly readable outdoors in bright sunlight. The other models can reach around 3600 nits at peak brightness. That's more than enough for comfortable outdoor use. There is one small disadvantage compared with Samsung's latest flagship phones. The Pixels are more reflective because Samsung has been putting more emphasis on anti-reflective displays. Still, the Pixel screens look excellent. The foldable is a slightly different story. The Pixel 11 Pro Fold's internal display remains more reflective because of its plastic top layer. And while Google made the biggest chassis change to the Fold compared with last year's model, the difference isn't dramatic. It's only a few tenths of a millimeter thinner. That's something you'll notice if you compare the 2 phones side by side. But it's not enough to completely change how the phone feels. And it certainly doesn't feel as incredibly thin as Samsung's Galaxy Z Fold 8 Ultra. There's also an interesting thickness imbalance. The side with the cover display is thicker, and you can actually feel that difference when holding the phone. It doesn't hurt usability, but it's a strange tactile detail on a device that's supposed to feel more refined. The crease is also still fairly deep compared with the Z Fold 8, which has become much less noticeable. But Google does deserve credit for one important thing: durability. The Pixel 11 Pro Fold is IP68 rated for water and dust protection, and the back panel now uses a glass fiber composite that Google claims is extremely difficult to crack. The downside? It's still noticeably heavier than the newest foldables from Samsung and Motorola, so the display story is mostly positive. The flat pixels have excellent screens, while the Fold improves in durability, but still has some physical compromises. This is where Google has always had one of its biggest advantages. The Pixel 11 series ships with Android 17, and yes, you get the full collection of Google's own applications, but there's no unnecessary filler, no sponsored placements, and no collection of duplicate apps competing with each other. If you're already invested in Google's ecosystem, the Pixel is basically ready to go the moment you turn it on. And Google's version of Android simply has a certain feel to it. It's clean, polished, and consistent. But this year, there's also a lot more AI-powered Gemini appears throughout the Pixel experience and inside multiple applications. Some of those features are subtle, while others are more noticeable. For example, Gboard now includes AI-assisted voice transcription, built specifically into the Pixel experience. There's also Sign-to-Text Future, an accessibility feature powered by Google's DeepMind SL2T model. The system uses the phone's front camera to translate American Sign Language into written English through Gboard and Live Transcribe. And it isn't simply looking at hand movements. It can analyze one-handed and two-handed signing along with facial expressions to better understand grammar and tone. That can then be used for writing messages, performing searches, creating documents, replying through Live Transcribe, or interacting with Gemini. This is the kind of AI feature that makes more sense to me than simply adding AI everywhere for the sake of saying that a phone has AI. Google is also continuing its 7 years of OS updates, monthly security patches, and quarterly Pixel Drop feature updates. That's roughly on par with Samsung and longer than what most competitors offer. And there's another advantage. Google controls both the Pixel hardware and Android itself, so its updates tend to arrive quickly. Even Samsung can sometimes take months to distribute a new version of Android. So if software support and a clean Android experience matter to you, the Pixel 11 remains extremely difficult to ignore. Google has never really approached smartphone performance in the traditional way. The company openly acknowledges that its Tensor processors aren't designed to win benchmark competitions. Instead, Google focuses on the overall experience. The new Tensor G6 is claimed to offer up to 25% faster web browsing and up to 20% better power efficiency. It's a 7-core ARM chip, but the GPU remains essentially the same class of PowerVR graphics hardware used in last year's G5. There's also a new MediaTek modem. On a day-to-day basis, though, the Pixel 11 phones feel excellent. Animations are smooth. Touch response is immediate. Apps open quickly. And interestingly, the Pixel can sometimes feel faster than a Galaxy S26, even though Samsung's phone is technically the more powerful device on paper. That's because raw benchmark performance doesn't always translate directly into how responsive a phone feels. Thermal stability is another advantage. The Tensor chip is able to maintain its performance relatively well during extended use, losing less than 25% of its performance in the reference testing. But gaming is where Google's approach becomes more complicated. The same GPU limitation that helps explain the lower benchmark numbers also affects demanding games. If you're playing something graphically intensive like Genshin Impact or the mobile version of Red Dead Redemption, the Pixel will generally deliver lower frame rates than high-end Qualcomm or Apple chips. For the simpler free-to-play games that most people play, however, the Pixel has more than enough power. So performance depends heavily on what you actually do with the phone. For everyday use, excellent. For heavy gaming, not the best choice. Battery life is also a little complicated this year. All of the Pixel 11 batteries are slightly smaller. The flat models lose less than 100 milliamp hours, while the Pixel 11 Pro Fold loses more than 200 milliamp hours compared with last year's foldable. Despite that, Google is claiming roughly similar battery life across the lineup, somewhere between 24 and 30 hours, depending on the model. And that's good, but it's also a little disappointing. We've been stuck around the one-day battery life window for a very long time, and ideally, every new generation should be pushing beyond it. Google doesn't seem particularly interested in making that leap yet. There is some good news when it comes to charging. The Pixel 11 Pro XL finally gets a meaningful charging upgrade, reaching 45 watts instead of 30 watts. The base Pixel 11, 11 Pro, and Pixel 11 Pro Fold remain at the lower charging speeds, but wireless charging has improved across the lineup, with all of the models now supporting 25-watt wireless charging when paired with a compatible QI2 pad. So the Pixel 11 isn't reinventing battery life. It's refining an experience that was already fairly good. And now we get to one of the areas where Pixel phones remain particularly strong. Google has made a few changes to the camera hardware this year. The Pixel 11 Pro and Pro XL share the same basic camera configuration: a 50-megapixel primary camera, a 48-megapixel 5x telephoto, and a 48-megapixel ultrawide. The primary and telephoto sensors are new components designed to provide better optical quality. The standard Pixel 11 and Pixel 11 Pro Fold also get a new 48-megapixel primary sensor. The Fold keeps its 10-megapixel 5x telephoto and 13-megapixel ultra-wide from last year. Meanwhile, the standard Pixel 11 gets a new 13-megapixel ultra-wide, alongside the same 10-megapixel telephoto used on the Fold. But, as usual with Pixel phones, the more interesting changes are happening in software. And while some of these features are clever, they aren't necessarily revolutionary. One example is Magic Capture. Instead of simply pressing the shutter button yourself, you can let the on-device AI handle the timing. Once activated, the phone begins recording video. Then, when the AI determines that the right moment has arrived, it can capture full-quality still photos as well. In theory, that's extremely useful for unpredictable moments. And in practice, it works reasonably well. If the scene isn't too chaotic and your subject is roughly in the middle of the frame, the AI can reliably recognize the right moment. But it's not perfect. Then, there's Instant Night Sight on the Pro models. The name might make it sound completely instantaneous, but that's not really the case. You'll still see a timer telling you to hold the phone still. The difference is that the capture process is noticeably faster, and that matters. Sometimes the difference between a blurry night photo and a usable one is simply how quickly the phone can complete the capture. So while it isn't truly instant, it's still a meaningful improvement. And then we get to the part that Pixel cameras have been known for years: the actual results. Photos from the Pixel 11 series are impressively sharp. The processing is fast, and moving subjects can remain surprisingly clear. Even expensive flagship phones from Samsung and Apple can struggle with this in certain situations. Google's dynamic range is also excellent. The cameras do a very good job of preserving detail in both bright areas and shadows. So while the hardware changes this year aren't revolutionary, Google's computational photography continues to do a lot of the heavy lifting. And honestly, that's still one of the biggest reasons to buy a Pixel. In conclusion, which Pixel takes the series crown? The Pixel 11 series feels less like a dramatic new chapter and more like Google perfecting a formula it already knows works. And if you already own a recent Pixel, that may be the most important thing to consider. So if you want the most balanced Pixel experience, the Pixel 11 Pro models are the obvious place to look. If you want the simplest Pixel experience without paying for features you may not need, the standard Pixel 11 still delivers the core experience extremely well. And if you're interested in the foldable, the Pixel 11 Pro Fold is considerably more durable, although its weight, thickness balance, and crease still leave room for improvement. But what do you think? Is the Pixel 11 really worth upgrading to, or is Google playing it too safe this year? Let me know your opinion in the comments. And if you enjoyed the video, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for more smartphone reviews, comparisons, and the latest tech. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.